Hello, one and all, and welcome back to Constitutional Considerations, where we consider all things constitutional. I'm your host, Tucker Tyree, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive into free speech, possibly our most important and alienable right. But sometimes, in some circumstances, the First Amendment does not apply. Let's roll the intro. Today on Constitutional Considerations, we are asking the question, when is it okay to put a muzzle on free speech? In the United States, speech is protected, but not all speech. For example, anything that would incite a riot is not protected speech. Fighting words fall under this unprotected category as well.
Hey you, let's fight! Them's fighting words.
What I'm saying is that content, context, and location matters. For example, yelling fire in a crowded theater that is, in fact, not on fire is not protected speech. But doing so in a theater that is on fire is highly encouraged. In certain locations, like a school, the line between protected and unprotected speech often gets blurry. For example, back in 1969, this girl on the right, Mary Beth Tinker, wore a black armband to school to protest the Vietnam War. Of course, her school didn't like that. The court ruled that political speech by a student is protected, so long as it does not materially and substantially interfere with the operation of the school. That case was foundational for drawing the line between freedom of speech of students and the role that administrators play in keeping order in a school. Let's explore that line of freedom of speech and balancing order in a school a little bit more. The case we are looking at today is Frederick versus Morse. Joseph Frederick, a high school student, was the plaintiff in this case. Joining us by phone is one of Joseph's close friends, Stephen. Stephen, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tucker.
So, let's jump right into things. Tell me what happened. This all was just a few years ago, right?
Right. So it was 2002, and the Olympic torch was being carried through my town, Juneau, Alaska. Me, Joseph, and some of our other friends decided to try and get on national television by holding up a sign. Our school let us out early, and our teachers supervised us as we walked a few blocks away to watch the parade. But I don't think the school knew about the sign until we held it up. It was hilarious. However, our principal, Miss Morse, didn't find it as funny as we did.
What did the sign say that made Mrs. Morse so mad?
It said, "Bong hits for Jesus." We weren't trying to promote drug use or anything. We were just trying to get on TV.
So, what did Principal Morse do?
She was livid. She barked at Joe to take down the sign and get into her office. She gave him a 10-day suspension. His parents weren't too happy with her decision, mostly because he wasn't even in the school when it happened. So they went to the district supervisor. I think the supervisor tried to walk on a very thin line because all he did was make Miss Morse shorten the suspension. That's really when all this craziness started.
And by this craziness, you mean the court cases?
Yeah, I talked to Joseph about it after the Supreme Court had made their decision. He said that the ACLU approached them after they talked to the district supervisor. Past that, I don't really know any details. I haven't spoken to Joseph in years.
Can you tell me more about the day? Were you holding the sign with Joseph?
I helped hold the sign, but I didn't help make it. As we were all standing there on the side of the road, people lined the streets as far as you could see. All Joseph kept saying was something about getting on TV. I don't really know what he was up to, but if it got us on TV, well, count me in. I had no idea it would turn into all this. I just remember my hands were freezing holding the sign. It was really cold. Well, when isn't it cold in Alaska?
Stephen, I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate your perspective on all this. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So next up, we're going to shift our focus a little bit because, as we all know, there's always two sides to a story. We're actually going to get to interview a teacher from Joseph's high school from when all this went down, right after this short commercial break.
It's hard to believe that 5G is as amazing as everyone is saying, so we've brought in Mint Mobile Head of Technology, Rizwan Kasim, to explain it to us. Riz?
Well, 5G is substantially more spectrally efficient with lower latency, so it's an order of magnitudes improvement over 4G.
It seems we may never know what 5G is, so we're just going to give it away for free with every plan until we can figure that out.
No, we're not. Oh, I guess we are.
We are. Thank you for trying, Riz.
I thought my explanation was good.
No, God, no.
Welcome back to Constitutional Considerations, where we are joined by a high school history teacher from Juneau Douglas High School in Juneau, Alaska. Due to the strong opinions on both sides in this case, our guest has asked us to remain anonymous. Anonymous teacher, how you doing today?
Hey, Tucker. Glad to be on the show.
So, I know you've been listening in, and I know that you know everything that we know so far. So, I've been told you know the rest of the story?
I do, actually. I was good friends with Deborah when this whole situation happened.
And by Deborah, you mean Deborah Morse, the principal when this all went down?
That's the one. I got to talk to her a lot about it, and it was pretty interesting to hear the ins and outs of all the various court decisions.
Would you mind walking us through all that?
I'd be glad to, Tucker. So basically, like Joseph's friend said, the Fredericks appealed to the school district superintendent who backed Principal Morse's decision, but shortened the suspension to 8 days. From there, the ACLU got involved and helped Joseph file suit because he felt like his free speech rights were being violated. At first, the federal district court rejected Joseph's request for an injunction.
Rejected it. Interesting.
Yeah, they found that the principal did not violate his First Amendment rights.
I actually have that ruling right here. It says that they sided with the principal because the sign, and I quote, directly contravened the board's policies relating to drug use and prevention.
Right. Of course, Joseph appealed, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the ruling in favor of Joseph. They said that Joseph should have been allowed to hold up the sign. Well, that's when the Supreme Court got involved.
So the U.S. Supreme Court took the case. What did the court rule?
That's actually an interesting question. To understand what they ruled, you first really have to understand the questions at play here. Do students' First Amendment rights continue at a public school? Is the topic of illegal drug use protected at a public school? Do teachers have qualified immunity from damages? Well, in essence, are teachers protected from lawsuits because they're following school policy? So first off, all sides agreed that Deborah, the principal, has qualified immunity, and there weren't any dissenting opinions on that.
So the principal isn't personally responsible.
Yeah, but the other questions are not as clear-cut. In a 5-4 ruling, the court decided that freedom of speech does not apply in a school setting to messages that promote illegal drug use. There were all kinds of concurring and dissenting opinions on this one.
Can you tell us about them?
Sure. So I think the two concurring opinions came from Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, but even they didn't agree with each other. Justice Thomas said that freedom of speech does not apply to students in a school environment, period. Justice Alito, on the other hand, emphasized that this ruling should only be applied to pro-drug messages and that students should have freedom to speak about all sorts of other political issues.
Yes, my producers gave me some quotations from some of the concurring opinions, and Justice Alito, I have part of his right here, and I quote, I therefore conclude that public schools may ban speech advocating illegal drug use, but I regard such regulation as standing at the far reaches of what the First Amendment permits.
That's the one.
So, do you happen to have any insights as to why they believe what they do?
Kind of. I've done a lot of reading about these justices since it happened, and from what his ruling implies, Justice Thomas was an originalist. He bases his opinion on the original intent of the law.
Right, which is why, in his concurring opinion, he wrote, and I quote, in the earliest public schools, teachers taught and students listened. Teachers commanded and students obeyed. Teachers did not rely solely on the power of ideas to persuade. They relied on discipline to maintain order. That is sort of the personification of originalism.
Exactly, and right, but on the other hand, Justice Alito's opinion was more like textualism. Basically, he bases his opinion on what the law actually states, regardless of what people were thinking when they wrote it. This is why he believes that this ruling really is on the extreme end of when speech is not protected in a school.
This is some incredible insight. Thank you. Earlier you mentioned there was a dissenting opinion?
Oh, yeah. The minority argued that the banner was a mere joke and didn't actually promote drug use. Their argument is best summed up by Justice Stevens.
If you don't mind me interjecting, we actually have part of Justice Stevens' quotation here. Like I said earlier, another quotation. Among other things, the court's ham-handed categorical approach is deaf to the constitutional imperative to permit unfettered debate, even among high school students, about the wisdom of the war on drugs or legalizing marijuana for medical use.
Exactly. Stevens' perspective is more like judicial activism. His opinion goes beyond the text to consider the societal impacts of the decision. Stevens injects his own perspective into what's right into his dissenting opinion.
Wow, thank you so much for all your insight. I feel like I just took a masterclass in judicial opinions.
Well, my free insight is only worth what you paid for it, Tucker. Thanks for having me on the show.
We're going to go to a quick commercial break, but stick around because soon after the break, we're going to talk to a principal and how he uses these sorts of court rulings to inform policy at his school. And still later in the show, we have a state representative coming on to talk about how core American values affected the outcome of this case. Stick around, you don't want to miss it.
Volkswagen, das Auto.
Welcome back to the show. We are talking about the balance between students' freedom of speech and administrators' responsibility to maintain order in a school. Joining us now is Father Chris Beretta, the former principal of Bishop Verot High School in Fort Myers, Florida, and current principal of Salesianum right in our own backyard of Wilmington, Delaware. Father Beretta, I'm interested in how you use cases like Frederick v. Morse to inform your own policies at your schools. But as I understand it, you work at a private school, so I'm assuming that things are a little bit different between how things are handled there and how they're handled at public schools.
So in a private school, everyone understands that this is what you signed on for, and that school is free to say, here are the values that we espouse, here are the policies that we have. You are free to enter into this contract law rather than constitutional law arrangement. And so as a result of that, those discussions, while sometimes people are frustrated with an individual decision, they didn't really get very far as like claiming their First Amendment rights, because you kind of signed off on as a private school, here is a very specific way in which we are going to provide this education. You are free to enter into it or not.
So these lawsuits really define the line between freedom of speech and maintaining order in public schools. Have you ever had a lawsuit in your time in the helm of a private school?
I don't think a court would even accept a case from a private school unless unless a law was being broken. I don't think anyone would ever. I think it wouldn't even be accepted because
if it is publicly funded by tax dollars, then the government has to strike that balance between maintaining order and freedom of speech. But if it's a private school, that agreement becomes a contractual issue, not a constitutional one. Very, very interesting. So, if you've never taken a discussion like this to court, can you tell me about a time when a class discussion maybe went too far?
That usually never gets to me, but that sometimes, as you probably know, that does happen in class where sometimes people feel like things, there wasn't a lot of space to express dissenting opinions.
Interesting. So even though it is under contract law, you have a whole lot more latitude to draw those lines wherever it goes, but you still promote discussion in those schools. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
No rights that we have are completely limitless. There's always kind of extenuating factors. There's the classic example of people can't go into a crowded theater and yell fire and start a stampede and say well, I have a right to freedom of speech. I can say whatever I want. There's consequences to our words. Even the ones that are constitutionally protected, there can still be consequences. I might, people might lose respect for me because of I might be able to state this political position, but people might lose respect for me or might, it's not, you're not protected from consequences. You're just protected from political consequences, right? So,
right, and consequences can come on both sides of the ball. Students can experience consequences by getting kicked out of school, and schools can get consequences if their policies are too far away from what their community values. That's very interesting. So, tell me about reach and how far you can dictate what a student does. Does your reach end when a student leaves campus?
that question about reach is really interesting. So let me use a non-freedom of speech example. So if it's pretty clear that if someone is juuling in the hallway, what's going to happen? But what happens if somebody gets seen at Trolley Square juuling, right?
Right. So if a student is doing something in Trolley Square, the public hangout near your school, should the school be able to control that?
Now, if that's a public school, there is absolutely no way that they are going to extend themselves beyond the property of that school. All right. You're in the parking lot, you're still fair game, but once you're over the line, like no one is going to pursue you and be concerned about your e-cigarette usage. Okay. So, but for us, like we say like, hey, this is something that we are going to continue to pursue it. What you do outside of school is part of who you bring into the school. Even if you don't ever bring any said objectionable, devices into the building, you're still like, that's part of who you are. That's part of the habits you're cultivating outside school. Those things still have an impact. So we are pretty clear and upfront that reach can extend pretty far. So a good freedom of speech issue would be what people post online. I'm not at school. This is a private conversation with me and my friends.
Right. So as a private school, you can reach into their personal lives because they want to be a member of your community. So you can influence who they are outside of school?
So yeah, we do. Not just because people have put that out, we do say like, who you are outside of school is really important to us. And some of that might appear to infringe on your freedom of expression. But as I said, freedom of speech does not mean I can say whatever I want and there's not going to be any consequences. So the reach extends pretty far.
So tell us about a time that you exercised that reach.
So I'll use an example from Florida. There was a kid who had a Confederate flag in the back of his pickup truck, in the back window of his pickup truck. And I told him, that a lot of people took offense to that. And it had like a Bishop Verot sticker, like right on the, like, so you couldn't, even when he was driving away from school, like it was clear that this person was a member of our community or was a supporter of our community at the very least. And as it turned out, he was a student of our community. And, that was a really difficult conversation to have about, did the school have any right to tell him what he could put on his car? Like, that's pretty interesting.
So as a private school, you can have a much more controlling handbook than at a public school would be considered unconstitutional. You can even tell a kid to not put a flag on his car.
But I think that was a really good example, that kid with the flag. And he was upset because there was a kid who like had a Jamaican flag on who was Jamaican and had a Jamaican flag on like the front license plate kind of thing, like was a Jamaican flag. And he was like, what's the difference? And it's like, okay, there's a pretty big difference, I think. I think we all know that the Confederate flag is a loaded symbol. But it was interesting, as far as like what was the reach of the school in that situation, his car,
So you obviously get involved with larger issues and pretty significant ones like Confederate flags. What would be a pretty simple case in your opinion?
But more easier ones would be like people wearing on a dress down day here. But at public school, like what can you wear? Like what things are going to trigger other people, right? So if somebody wears a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, or if somebody wears a MAGA t-shirt, or if somebody wears schools like kind of want to keep the peace and they don't want people like, getting into big arguments. So it gets pretty interesting, right? In terms of like, what do you want? You're not trying to squelch discussion, but it's slogans and shirts and hats and masks even, is that the best way to do it? And can the school say, like, there's a better way to discuss these? And if you're really into sharing ideas and perspectives, there's a better way to do this than just you're allowed to do whatever you want.
So I can probably guess what you would do if someone were to come in with a Bong Hits for Jesus shirt.
I'd probably shut down pretty fast. Just a guess.
Got it.
Just a guess.
Jamaican flag good, Bong Hits bad. Father Beretta, you're a gentleman and a scholar. Thank you so much for spending your time with us.
I hope that helps.
Joining us next is Representative John Lawrence. He's a state representative for the 13th Congressional District in Pennsylvania. John, thanks for coming on the show today.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So, as a legislator, you take core American values and put them into law. How do American values help you draw the line between maintaining school order and student freedom?
Yeah, so our founders were really smart people. And when you read the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law regarding, and then it outlines 5 of our core freedoms, one of which is freedom of speech. So one of the things that I try to point out to folks when I'm talking to school groups or, Cub Scouts or whatever it might be, is that it doesn't say that Salesianum shall make no law. It says Congress shall make no law. So as we look at this case, Frederick v. Morse, the courts over the years have looked at public schools and school districts as an extension of the government. But private schools typically are not afforded that same coverage. So whether Frederick had taken his action here in a private school or in a public school, in this case, he actually didn't take place at a school at all. It took place across the street from a school. But that would have a material bearing on the case.
Right. So as you're looking at legislating and drawing the line between the school's responsibility to protect order and the students' liberties and freedoms, what do you take into consideration when drawing this line?
Usually these things, these kind of fine points are usually sorted out in the courts. And as you look across free speech cases, and particularly when it involves young people and students and schools, there's a couple themes that this has been litigated many times over the years, and there's some themes that kind of come to the fore, right? One of those themes is that the Supreme Court tends to place a high value on political speech. So that is held to a great premium. So we just came through an election. I think it's fair to say it was a fairly divisive election. And there's a lot of folks who would say, well, I don't like negative ads, and I don't like this, and I don't like that. And, I wish candidate A wouldn't say that about candidate B. But the courts have held that, again, political speech, they are very reluctant to come in on a political speech issue.
That certainly is a theme in many cases. The courts certainly love to protect political speech. You mentioned there were 3 themes. What are the other 2?
There's kind of 2 other cases that were settled previously that kind of speak into this case, right? So one of them is this case, Tinker v. Des Moines, all right? So in that case, and that was decades ago, there were kids who wore black armbands in a silent protest of the Vietnam War. And that the school said you couldn't do it, and it ended up going all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that, first of all, it was political speech. They said it was okay. The kids were allowed to have worn those armbands. And there were kind of two things there. One is that it was political. They were protesting the Vietnam War. The other thing is that it wasn't seen as disruptive, right? So they weren't chanting something, or they weren't disrupting class. They were silently wearing an armband. All right, so that's kind of one case. Then another case that kind of speaks into the case that your class is looking at is this Bethel School District v. Fraser. So in that case, you had a student get up and give what the court said was a profane and lewd speech in nominating his classmate for student president. All right, so the courts didn't look too favorably on that. So profane and disruptive speech in school is not looked upon with friendly lenses in the courts. So now as we roll those two seemingly kind of not contradictory, but they're both kind of two interesting cases. Now as that rolls into this case, right, where this kid was standing across the street from the school, unfurls the banner that was supposedly inferring that it was okay to use illegal drugs, right? Is that a political statement? Didn't seem to be a political statement. Was it disruptive? Apparently the school administration thought it was disruptive. Was it lewd? The school administration thought it was promoting an illegal activity, right? So that's kind of the construction of where they ended up with. And it was a close case. It's a 5-4 decision.
Is it political? Is it disruptive? Is it lewd? That's a really good perspective to have on all these cases. So do these cases about between teachers and students about political speech inside of schools have any effect, or do they tell us anything about cases outside of schools between people who aren't students and teachers?
We see Facebook as a forum for people to express their ideas. Does Facebook have the right, or maybe some might say the obligation, to censor or self-regulate the speech that is going on their platform? Now, Facebook's not the government either, right? They're an independent private corporation. And there are a number of folks who would say they can do whatever they want. It's their own platform. They could make a rule that says, anybody who talks about wearing a blue shirt on Tuesdays is not allowed to talk about that on Facebook. That's their prerogative. There are others who would say, well, this is, supposed to be a forum for people to share their ideas. And this is not a controversial statement. This is not we're not espousing some sort of extremist viewpoint. We're just talking about blue shirts, right? So they should allow for that. So that's another interesting question that is a very pertinent question for some of the things that are being debated today.
So we're left with two competing ideas. The school is an extension of the home, and they can make any laws and enforce them how they see fit. And school is a place to encourage debate during the formative years of its students. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Representative, thank you so much for your time today.
Tucker, it was my pleasure. And, I went to Wilmington Christian School. I graduated from WCS. And even though Salesianum beat us in soccer, I think every year when I was there, it was still my pleasure to come in and speak with you today.
Go Sallies. Ladies and gentlemen, Representative John Lawrence, there was some great insight. Now, here at Constitutional Considerations, we love to hear from our listeners. It's not just the smart people who are talking. I mean, I host it. So, right after the commercial break, we're going to come back with some callers, and after that, wrap up the show. Stick around.
We love the new apartment.
The natural light is amazing.
Hardwood floors.
There is a bit of a clogging problem.
At least Geico makes it easy to bundle our renters and car insurance.
Yeah, helping us save even more.
For bundling made easy, go to geico.com.
Welcome back to Constitutional Considerations. Let's get to our callers. Hello, caller number 1. Welcome to Constitutional Considerations. You are live on the show.
Thanks for taking my call, Tucker. I have to admit, though, listening to your show today has me frustrated. It sounds like you are all defending the Supreme Court's decision here. Isn't this a blatant overstep of the government to reach through the school to muzzle the opinions of students? I thought they were inalienable rights. It's hardly inalienable if the courts can take them away so easily. I mean, think about it. The kid wasn't on campus. It wasn't a school project. And shouldn't we encourage things that spark conversations about topics that are currently under significant debate?
I'm not really sure I follow you on that one. Is there really a debate on whether or not Jesus should be taking bong hits?
No, funny. But really, it is so un-American what the court did, and even worse, Justice Thomas's originalism. That's just an embarrassment. His whole concept of ruling school children with strict discipline is just not applicable to modern education. We don't paddle students anymore, and we need to let them speak their mind. The children in America deserve better schooling than what that old fart is promising.
Wow, you're really energized about this one. So, would you say that you're not one for giving up personal liberties for the sake of the common good?
Hold on, you're putting words in my mouth. The common good is not at odds with healthy debate. Healthy debate is the common good. This ruling threw off the balance between order and liberty so that students can't speak their minds at school. This is a terrible way to educate the youth. That's just my take.
Well, thank you so much for your take. I really appreciate your comments and your passion. Next up, we have a caller who has a bit of a different opinion. Caller, what's on your mind?
I'm honestly disappointed. That previous caller is willing to risk the safety of children and order in a school just to promote a pro-drug message.
So, are you saying that this case doesn't shift the balance between order and liberty?
Oh, it absolutely does, but I agree with the Supreme Court that this is a necessary shift. Pro-drug messages should never be acceptable on a school campus, and therefore should not be protected by the Constitution. I'm a teacher. You can't hamstring school administrators from shutting down student pranks. Joseph wasn't promoting a debate about drugs. He was just trying to be cool by idolizing drug use. If he was promoting a serious debate, I would feel differently. Anyways, that's my 2 cents. Thanks for having me.
Wow, it seems like I struck a nerve here. These callers are hot. Before they can start a fire on the show, let's move on to our next caller. Caller, what's on your mind?
What's the big deal? Nothing personal, but why are you spending a whole episode on this? I've been looking all over Twitter and Facebook, and I haven't seen a single thread about it. Furthermore, no social media movement came out about bong hits for Jesus. And as far as I'm aware, the ACLU is the only organization who cared enough to get involved. Why are we talking about this? This has such little impact about what's going on in the real world.
Well, I appreciate your criticism, but I disagree with your notion that schools aren't part of the real world, especially in situations of constitutional questions.
Yeah, I see your point. But isn't this all just a distinction without a difference? So one kid gets suspended. Does this really matter?
Well, the ACLU thought it mattered enough to supply resources, lawyers, and everything else. Without the ACLU, this probably doesn't go past the district superintendent. They cared enough to make this case, well, a case.
I just don't see what all the fuss is about. Thanks for hearing me.
I hear you. Thanks for coming on the show. We have time for one more caller. Final caller of the day. How are you feeling about all this?
Hey, Tucker. I just wanted to pile on to that last guy.
Okay, go ahead.
Not everyone knows this, but Frederick versus Morse is a big frickin' deal. It was actually used as precedent in some recent court cases. It is changing the balance between order and liberty.
Oh, please, tell me what you know.
Well, there's 2 cases that really get my point across. The first, Layshak versus Hermitage School District. That was a case brought because Layshak made a parody MySpace account. It was about his principal, and get this, it said he was a big steroid freak, a big hard ass, and a big whore who smoked a big blunt.
Wow, that's a lot of bigs right there. Apparently, this is no longer a family show. Well, I would hope that the principal would just laugh that along. I'm guessing he didn't?
Unfortunately, not at all, Tucker. The principal took it very seriously. The student was severely punished and ended up suing the school district. The court ruled that his speech was protected, specifically noting Frederick v. Morse. Even though Frederick fell in favor of administrators maintaining order, the court ruled that parody, including making fun of your principal, does not threaten school order.
So, Jesus taking bong hits does threaten school order, but making fun of your principal does not?
Right. Apparently, that's the line our courts have drawn.
Interesting. So, you mentioned earlier that there were 2 cases. Would you mind telling me about the other one?
Of course. The other case, Boeing versus Fulton County. Basically, a student wrote in a dream journal that she had a dream that she wanted to shoot her math teacher. As she was passing her journal to a friend, her teacher intercepted it, and that teacher read it. Of course, the girl got punished, and the girl sued the school district for violating her free speech.
When will students learn to not pass notes in class? What happened in the case?
Well, here, the courts ruled in favor of the school district. The courts actually expanded on the ruling of Frederick v. Morse, saying that violent speech should not be protected on school campus. You know, this is kind of in line with everything we already know about speech. Our Constitution favors safety over freedom of speech every single time. can't yell fire in a crowded theater, and you have to take threats against a teacher seriously, even if they are just notes in a dream journal.
Wow, thanks for the input.
Thanks for taking my call, Tucker.
The pleasure was all mine. Well, that does it today for our show at Constitutional Considerations, where we get to explore the line between student liberty and school order. Our last caller reminds us that every single time that a student makes fun of his principal on MySpace or a note is passed in class, this line is redrawn. The answer is never definitive. If you have any questions about the show today, please feel free to reach out to us. Our number here is 1-800-Constitutional Considerations. Once again, that's 1-800-CON Institutional Considerations. I really hope you enjoyed the show today, and thank you so much for watching this episode of Constitutional Considerations, where we consider all things constitutional.